listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation. Your host, Ben Worthington.
Key vocabulary for summarising 2 pie charts. Hello there, IELTS students. In this tutorial, Daphne and I were going to be looking at the key vocabulary you need to summarise and describe 2 pie charts. The first one is going to be 2 pie charts within the same time frame, and then Daphne is going to explain or basically going to give us insights about how to summarise 2 pie charts with different time frames, because you need different language. So how are you doing today, Daphne?
I'm fine, thanks, Ben. How are you? Hi, everybody.
I'm doing good, thanks. I'm doing good. It's really sunny here, so at the weekend, cycling, eating the local foods. I think it was some hake, fried hake, absolutely delicious.
Ooh,
next to the river.
I love eating fresh fish. That is so good. Last weekend I had some fresh prawns.
Ooh.
I mean, they were so delicious. Really, really fantastic. Such a treat.
Down at the coast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh,
sitting on the beach eating prawns. It was really good.
Yeah, the fish and chips next to the coast always taste different. It always tastes better.
Yeah, perfect. You have to watch out for seagulls. Seagulls are these really big, no, not really big, quite big, rather aggressive, rather noisy white birds. And they've got used to stealing food from people. They're quite brave and quite bold. And there was one man who just bought his fish and chips. He looked really happy about it. And the seagull flew down and literally sort of kind of threw attacked the chips almost, which fell on the floor. And then there was a flock of more birds that started eating the chip. Poor man.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It happened in a second.
Yeah, and you totally don't expect it either, do you? And
then I think you feel such an idiot.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I was going to say, is you feel like an idiot because this bird is tiny, and if you were prepared and if you were alert, you could have totally avoided it. But then you just get humiliated by this disgusting seagull. I mean, well, they don't look disgusting, but the way they behave is totally
not nice.
It's not English, is it? It's not cricket.
No, not very polite.
Okay, let's jump into it. So as you know, we're going to describe in this tutorial, we're going to look at 2 pie charts. First, I'll be looking at one within basically the same time frame, and then Daphne will look at one with different time frames because we need different language. But before we jump into this, we're going to look at the language that we need. And of course, you need to handle language of percentages, proportions, and this is going to vary depending on the topic and the content of your chart. Okay, so what kind of language will we need to start off with, Daphne?
Okay, so we need language first to describe. Ben just mentioned that important word. Describe proportions. So some of the key words are percent, and correctly we spell that as 2 words. I'm feeling guilty here because I normally spell it as 1 word. Percentage, obviously, proportion, amount, and share. So those are quite useful words. Let's go through those again. Percent, percentage, proportion, amount, and share. And the other one maybe you could have is segment. So these are the parts of your pie chart. The next thing we need to be able to do is to use the language of comparison.
Hold on, Daphne. Could you use chunk?
I think chunk's a bit informal, Ben, don't you? I would definitely, if someone said chunk, I would definitely pick them up and say, I don't think that's a very academic word.
There's a proper big chunk on the right, for example.
Absolutely not, Ben, no.
Just kidding.
No, we need to be academic, unlike Ben.
No.
This is we need to be showing high level, really professional language.
Totally, yeah. Chunk, it's You could maybe use it in your speaking, but you definitely do not ever want to use it in your academic writing. It's just a very informal, well, it's not it's just informal way. You probably use it around a dinner table, for example, with your family or friends. But anyway, let's go into it. So language of comparison.
Yeah, we've looked at this before, obviously. So language of comparison, which country, for example, had the largest or the smallest share? So you're going to be looking at the most or the least, the largest, the smallest, the heaviest, the lightest. I mean, with this one, it's more like to do with size. And then comparing, so more than something, less than something, and greater or smaller. So the first lot, the small, largest, smallest, is obviously the superlatives, and then the comparatives with the greater, smaller. So look at that, make sure you're happy with lots of different comparative structures. Also, structures for if you're comparing things that are the same. So it was as small as or as large as. So that's when you have two things that are similar that you need to compare. Make sure you're happy with that kind of language.
Absolutely, and I'll just emphasize, knowledge of the superlatives is essential. It's going to enrich. Obviously, it's essential for your academic task 1. It's going to enrich it automatically, and it's going to automatically force you to make comparisons, obviously. And also, it's going to help you with your speaking, because it just enriches your speaking. For example, if you say London is a very busy city, when I went there, it was a very busy city, and it probably still is. Or you could say, I think it was the busiest city I have ever been to, or I had ever been to. You know, just enriching it, embellishing your story, adding some colour, and adding some, I wouldn't say drama, but you're definitely going to enrich it by using superlatives.
Yeah.
Okay, right then. Now, I'm going to just give you a brief overview of how I would approach a certain, a typical pie chart problem. Right in front of me now, I've got 2 pie charts, and the title is EU 28 main trade partners in food and drink 2018. Brackets, percentage, and euro billion. So that's important that we pay attention to these little indicators, because now we could say, because below these 2 pie charts, we've got exports on the left, imports on the right, and then below these 2 pie charts, we've got a horizontal bar chart with some figures, which would be quite useful, especially now that we know the currency. Anyway, so pay attention to those little sort of like the little points, the currencies, the times, the dates, and also, this is really important, take time to get to grips with the chart. For example, this one in front of me, and I strongly recommend you grab a pen and you start making notes. But as I said, on the left, it's exports. So what helped me to get to grips with this was, okay, so basically forming a sentence of sort of like, so exports of food and drink from Europe to the US, 18% of exports from Europe in food and drink went to the United States. I don't think it's 18, it's 16, sorry. 16%. Okay, so if you can start forming sentences that help you get to grips with what you are seeing. I mean, in the chart in front of me, I can see, well, both charts, I'm just going to get a feel for this, both charts show that the majority of exports, of the majority of food and drink exports from the European Union went to other countries, i.e. sort of like probably a wide range of other countries. The biggest single export partner, this is about topic vocabulary, so the biggest export partner or the biggest receiver of the European exports was the United States. Okay, so these sentences just help you get to grips with what is happening. Now,
Ben, you've done that. You've done that brilliantly. I don't want to interrupt your flow because you're in it, but that honestly, by making those sentences at the beginning, Ben is really showing that he understands what is in front of him, and it's a very. Sometimes I think on the task one, just taking that time just to look at it and make those sentences in your head. Now he knows exactly what he's going to be talking about. That was really good, Ben.
thank you. Yeah, and the other point I was going to say is that I kind of made a mistake because I said export partner, and export partner is something really different, and I can't remember specifically. Perhaps it's maybe a country the European Union exports with. I don't know, but it wasn't the right phrase. So, it's a good time just to really give your own vocabulary a shakedown and, get the phrasing correct. Because if you get the phrasing correct, it's going to guide you as to how you're going to be speaking and as to what is actually happening in front of you, or what is being shown. I think it's probably more accurate description. What is being shown, not happening, because this is not a dynamic chart. Okay, so moving on to the next chart, I would say, okay, the European Union imports over 64% of its products from other countries. The two largest countries that the EU imports from are Brazil and the United States, with around 8% each, or with around 8% each is fine there. So there's two things that I did there. I recognized the two biggest partners. That's important information, or the three biggest. But the reason why I focused on Brazil and United States was because they are the two biggest single countries. I don't want to keep writing about other, because it doesn't tell me that much. I say other is the largest source of imports. That's not very rich. But if I could say Brazil and United States are the two main countries from which the European Union import food from, that's detailed information, and I can get a grasp of what's happening. That's not to say I'm not going to mention other, but I'm definitely going to mention the two specific biggest partners who the European Union import food and drink from. And I'll probably mention Norway as well. I'll probably just go through I won't list it. I would try and do more grouping, because not only did I mention the Brazil and United States, but I grouped them together because they had pretty much the same percentage of around 8%. So, once I've got to grips with what is happening in front of me, and maybe I've jotted a few sentences down, I could possibly even start, once I've got my foundation and I've got it crystal clear in my mind what's happening, then I may start venturing out and making some comparisons. For example, exports, and this is where another good reason why we don't want to focus on other that much, because one, it's a clumsy sort of like statistic to describe. Other is responsible for 57%. It just doesn't, it's not that rich. Whereas if I could say the European Union exports, or the United States receives about 16%. No, you see, this is why the wording is so important. Let me rephrase this.
The direction is difficult, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So we could say the United States is responsible for 18% of the exports that the European Union sends out, whereas regarding food coming in, the United States is only responsible for half of that, with just 8%.
Good.
Or with just 8% of total imports coming into the European Union. Now, I'm saying this aloud, and I'm saying European Union a lot just to get the direction correct. if I was writing this out, I would probably edit it out, because when you're reading it, it's much clearer, and I don't have to be so explicit about the direction, and I can start editing it. But while I'm saying it out loud, I do want to get the direction. I do want to make the direction clear. Now, just some final points here regarding the graphs. So not only am I going to get the directions, the foundation, and get a real grasp of this, because as Daphne said, the direction is important. Once we've got a firm grasp of what's happening, then we can start talking about the comparisons between the two different sections, maybe the similarities, maybe start grouping the information. And a good group that I spotted would be regarding exports. We could say that maybe Japan, Russia, and Norway have roughly similar levels of, or receive roughly similar amounts of exports, with 5%, 4%, and 3% respectively. So hopefully the first time when I mentioned that, I said Japan, Russia, and Norway have broadly similar levels of receiving EU exports. Not the most beautiful way of saying it, but the point I wanted to say is that we can use the respectively sentence with 5%, 4%, and 3% respectively. So not only are we going to use a higher level sort of description, a higher level sentence with respectively, but we're also going to group the information. And using these higher level sentences is a good way to avoid the dreaded list format. And just one final thing before we finish, we've also got at the bottom, we've got a confusing chart, a horizontal bar chart with imports and exports. And here what I would do is just very briefly make a sentence and say, roughly regarding imports and exports, it's broadly similar, with 112 billion euros and 122 billion euros respectively for food and drink, whereas imports on a whole, the EU generally, or the EU broadly imports around 150, is it 150? 250 in primary goods, 250 billion euros worth of primary goods, more than it exports. Okay?
A good one.
So yeah, it is quite a mouthful. Obviously, if you're writing it down, you can just make notes. Having to verbalize it is a challenge while looking at the graph, but hopefully you get the idea. And just to summarize, we're looking at language of proportions, we're trying to make comparisons, we're making groups, and also we're trying to look for opportunities to include fancy sentences and also, as I said, the groups. So,
and actually, Ben, you've got, I mean, it's we say 2 pie charts, but there's actually 2 pie charts and a mini bar chart.
Exactly.
There's a lot of information in that picture for 170, 80 words and 20 minutes.
Exactly.
We just wanted to sort of say to everybody that the comparing pie charts or bar charts seems to be becoming more popular in the exam, or comparing a bar chart and a table. It is getting a little bit more frequent, these questions. So it is definitely worth testing yourself, trying one out, becoming more comfortable with how to do this.
Absolutely. But if you've covered the fundamentals, like the language of comparison, the superlatives, the fancy sentences, and if you've got a structure to follow, then it makes it much easier. On the online course, we go into this in much more detail. We provide sentences for you to just copy paste general sentences, more fancy sentences, more techniques, and most importantly, we give you the opportunity to test your knowledge, because without this feedback, you're not going to know which areas you're doing well, which areas are going bad, and it's much more challenging to improve.
Yeah.
All right, your turn, Daphne. We're going to...
Oh, thank you. Okay, so lucky me. Actually, I think I've got a nicer one than Ben. I'm looking at 2 pie charts. So what I've got is U.S. agricultural exports to Cuba, Financial year 2005, and the total there is $326 million. And financial year 2014, and the total there is $300 million. So what I'm going to do is same thing as we just did before. Look at the proportions to start with, and then looking to see what I compare. But what I have also can do here, which is the fun bit, I think, is describe the changes over time. So between 2005 and 2014, for example, so exports of soybean meal have grown from 5% in 2005 to 25% in 2014. So I could say either they've grown from 5% to 25%, or they've increased five-fold during the period in question. So I can talk about the percentage, the proportion of it, or I can do some kind of fancy language with that one.
Absolutely, and I'll just interrupt. It's very important to be aware of, if you cannot say it's increased by 20% to, you can't say it's increased at 20%, sorry, to 25%. You have to say it's increased from 5% to 25%, because if you say it's grown by 20%, that's a completely different number. And you need to be very aware that the prepositions, when you're talking about percentages, have a massive impact on what is actually being communicated.
Yeah, that's so right. That's so true. But what I can use, which Ben couldn't use, is the dynamic language. So the language to express change. So I'm going to give you another one, and I'm going to try and group a bit here. So in the first one, 2005, I got corn at 15%, which has fallen significantly from 15% to 9%. So I'm going to start a sentence like, for example, exports of corn have fallen significantly from 15% in 2005 to 9%. And then I'm going to do a comparison, whereas exports of soybeans have remained relatively stable at around 10%.
Super. Yeah. I was looking at soybean meal and I was like, hang on a second. No, it hasn't. But
yeah,
you're right.
I've just got soybeans. So it was 11% in 2005 and 10%. So I've just said relatively stable.
Yeah, totally. And this is this is what we were mentioning before, like grouping 11 and 10% in these terms and in this specific graph is practically the same. So yeah. It's perfect there. And I was just looking at the wrong section. That's why I didn't grasp it at first. But you're right. It's soybeans in orange and then soybean meal in green, which is the one that grew. Okay.
Exactly. We can do one more. So I've got meat, poultry, and products, which have gone from 20% in 2005 to 49%. So I can do a nice. Between the financial year 2005 and 2014, exports of poultry and meat have more than doubled.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and I could give the numbers, but I don't really need to. I think I can say more than doubled to represent half of the total exports in 2014.
Beautiful. I like this sentence specifically because, one, we've got this fancy language. It's more than doubled. It sounds so much richer than going for, it increased from 20% to 49%. That's dry. It's so doing it this way is much richer. And also, we finished it off with a very, very keeps using the word rich, but anyway, a very rich alternative of saying 40, instead of saying 49%, he said it increased to almost a half. So we've got two like fancy aspects to the sentence. And by the way, just as a side note, the economist.com daily chart does this every single, I think it's maybe every single day. It must be daily chart. But you can read and listen to these descriptions done very accurately and using this exact language. So if you want to get more of this kind of language, go to that resource I just mentioned.
I think I have had the nicer pictures than you, Ben, actually. Thanks for giving me the easy one.
Yeah, I find these charts interesting. And by the way, this is just another good point. If you find that you know the reason why exports may have decreased, or if you know the reason, or if you think you know the reason why US agricultural exports to Cuba of meat doubled between 2005 and 2014, doesn't matter. Do not mention it. Do not add extra information that's not there in the chat. Only report what you see in front of you. Yeah, I used to see this a lot of students.
Yeah,
offering
no
their
opinion.
experience.
Very important.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so moving on to the next point. Just as a quick overview, I was describing two different topics, or broadly related topics, imports and exports of the European Union in the same time frame. So I was using language of proportion and comparison, whereas Daphne had two pie charts on the same topics, but with different time frames. So she could use the language of proportion and comparison and change. And the change is, for some reason, I think what a lot of students love, is almost stabilized, has grew dramatically, all of this, which is typical for line charts, and maybe dynamic pie charts, whatever. But you can only use it with your pie chart when you've got two different time frames there. And obviously they're related.
And a quick word of caution on that one. Don't be too dramatic. Wild fluctuations. The number of times I read wild fluctuations, poor examiners must get quite bored of this word. Describe what you can see. Don't go over the top.
Yeah, sorry, my mind went somewhere else there. Of like a really dramatic task 1 description, exclamation marks and question marks. Will it drop in 2010? Or did it rise? Yeah. Okay, so some practical advice now then. As you heard myself when I was getting to grips with this one about the imports and exports, really get familiar with what you're seeing. If we're talking about imports and exports, really get to grips with the flow of the products, and start brainstorming some useful vocabulary. And also, this is a good time. Like, if any of those segments just jump out and pop at you, just maybe circle them or maybe write them down, because this is probably sort of like the general idea. This is probably the overview. Just to go back, when Daphne was describing the US exports to Cuba, the biggest one that jumped out at me was the doubling of poultry and meat products from 20 to 49%. So that's the big takeaway, and probably the soybean meal as well growing. So big sort of like segments like that and big changes. That's going to be what you'll include in your overview. And when you start, it's good to be aware of what's happening. Anything else there on practical advice, Daphne?
Yes, I think that this practical advice in a way leads on to the organisation, but takes me back, Bennett. We recorded a podcast recently about a 5-point strategy. So how to plan your task 1, knowing that you don't have very long, but we talked about a 5-point strategy in 5 minutes. And maybe I thought it's a nice time just to review that with you. So the first one was the time period and the vocabulary. So I had pie charts that changed over time. Ben didn't, but we both needed a vocabulary of exports. Step back, number 2, see the big picture. So as Ben just said, what struck him most when he was looking at it, and what are we talking about? Exports, imports, food, non-food, whatever it was. Decide on the most important things to include. So the extremes, we looked at that. Can you see any comparisons? So Ben did a lot of comparing. And then by the time you've done those things, next thing you're going to do is get ready and organize your answer. So it's just those 5 things to look at before you actually start writing.
Absolutely. And also, although we've given you the strategy, we're kind of giving you a very brief one. In the online course, we're going into this in much more detail. And as we said, we will give you the phrases. We make it much easier. We break it down into smaller components. We'll give you test tasks. We'll give you feedback on them. And we're just seeing some real improvements with students' writings, because this gets so much easier once you get in professionals to give you feedback, to give you the encouragement, to tell you what you're doing right, to guide you if you're going wrong. And it just makes it so much easier, especially if you are, well, for two types of students. The student who is self-study, who is preparing by themselves, this kind of guidance is essential. And also for the unlucky student in an academy, in a private academy, with incompetent teachers. Okay. Just because I heard so many stories, Daphne, of I don't know, student. I remember one student who was in New Zealand, but he jumped on a flight to Australia. This was pre-corona times, when this travel was much easier. But he jumped on a plane, went to Canberra, that's it, because there is a decent offer there for intensive English classes. And they just had a native English speaker who had just been thrown an IELTS textbook and just said, oh, go teach IELTS. Horrendous. So just to, I'm mentioning this because it's quite common for language academies just to hire a teacher who can do business English in the evenings, who could do children's English in the mornings, who could do conversational English for the adults at midday, and then IELTS in the afternoon. You do not want this kind of tutor. You want a professional who's just looking at your IELTS writing and speaking day in, day out. And that's why at IELTS Podcast, this is our specialization. We don't teach business English. We don't teach general English. We specifically prepare students for the IELTS. So it's it's really important that you get the right guidance, because with the right guidance, you can improve so much faster.
It is very specialist. It's a specialist exam, and it needs specialist preparation. Ben, I completely agree with you. You don't want to go in there cold, and it can be quite lonely, I think, studying on your own. So hopefully you feel you get to know us a bit through the podcast, and you get to know us through the corrections, and we're absolutely on your side.
Absolutely, yeah. That totally, yeah. And again, as I said, and as Daphne succinctly mentioned, that this is a specialist exam, so you need specialist preparation. And just one last thing before we finish: you do not want this to hold you back. You've learnt your own language, you probably know English. It's just a question of getting these specific exam skills, getting the guidance with some general English skills, with perhaps some errors that you might be making that you might not be unaware. Get those solved, and you're on your way. You're on your way to studying in the UK, to studying in Australia, to emigrating to Canada, or wherever. You are on your way, and we're here to help you get there. All right, I think that's everything. So thank you very much for listening, and good luck with your IELTS exam.
Good luck, everyone. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to IELTSPodcast.com.